can you tell us a little bit about the origins of this particular novel? What inspired you to write this particular work?
Yeah, thanks so much, Marcus. I'm so happy to have Marcus as my interlocutor tonight. And so I see lots of familiar faces. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. The weather was so beautiful today. It's one of those perfect Paris days. I thought even I wouldn't go see Jake Lamar. I'm stuck with the guy, so I have to be here. So anyway, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Much appreciated. So the origins of the novel were really threefold. It starts with my love of jazz. And I grew up, my parents, no one I knew in my life played an instrument growing up, but there were no musicians, there were no artists in my family, but everybody loved music. The radio was on, the record player was on. The first 10 years of my life between 1961 and 1971 coincided with one of the richest decades for popular music in the 20th century. My parents were jazz fans, and so it was just always on. And once I started writing, or taking my writing seriously, especially at college, I would listen to jazz when I wrote. And so years and books and all sorts of creative stuff written with jazz playing in the background, I think it was inevitable that someday I'd actually write about jazz. Second, I discovered the works of Chester Himes. I don't want to go on too long on Chester Himes now. We can come back to him. But this amazing African-American author. And growing up in New York, I revered three Black male writers of the mid-century, in particular, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Ralph Ellison. Only when I came to Paris, I discovered there was a fourth man. I'm not mentioning all the great women writers, but those are the four writers that I was preoccupied with. Chester Himes, once I discovered him in Paris, I was just blown away, and I couldn't believe no one in America had told me this was a great writer. But he was much appreciated by the French and had been for decades. So reading his work got me into that he wrote a series of Harlem crime novels that are just brilliant and satirical, full of ambiance, just great works. So I was reading a lot of Himes at this period, and Himes, jazz, and finally I stumbled upon this book that you have a copy of there. This is an amazing book, The Three Wishes. What's the rest of it? The Three Wishes, an intimate look at jazz greats. And this is a book of photographs and text collected by the woman known as the Jazz Baroness, Pananica de Koningsvater. We can talk about her later. She really existed. And she had this, she was this mécène, this what's the word? This patron, and groupie of the bebop generation. She was a Rothschild heiress, very wealthy woman, arrived in New York, parachuted into the jazz scene, bought a big Bauhaus-style house in New Jersey, and would have jazzmen come to her place and just hang out. And she started doing this thing in 1961 where she'd ask each musician, if you had three wishes to be granted instantly, what would they be? And she had them write the answers, or she wrote down the answers, and she took pictures of them. This book was first published in French. I discovered it in French about 20 years ago, was blown away. 2 or 3 years later, it came out in English. And it's just amazing. You're just totally plunged into that atmosphere of those jazz greats of the early 60s. So it was those three things. Once I read this book, I thought, oh, I know how to write about jazz now. Somehow I can mix this with Harlem and a Himesian vibe, and that was the start of the book.
You said you didn't want to talk about a lot about Himes at this moment, but I want to put Himes among a group of people, and I'm fascinated by all the authors you reference in this, and that whose work becomes woven into the very structure of the narrative, right? That goes along. So, I mean, we got Greek tragedy in here. We have Machiavelli's The Prince. We have Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. and also the crime novels of Chester Himes. So I'm reading this, I'm like, damn, I got to go do research on this, to read a little bit more. But it's so wonderfully woven into the book. Again, is that you just, I don't think, it doesn't seem like you're name dropping, but you're weaving this complex story that seems about America too, but also about a whole, pardon me, library of ideas.
Yeah, well, the milieu is the crime world. So the book is set in Harlem between 1936 and 1961. My protagonist, Clyde Morton, grows up in Alabama, dreams of becoming a great trumpet player like Louis Armstrong, arrives in New York, and on his first day is told he has no talent whatsoever. He's devastated, but he hangs around. He loves Harlem, and through a series of coincidences becomes a chieftain of the underworld in Harlem, a major gangster. And in the course of writing about his gangster life, and it's in conversations with his mentor, a fellow named Mr. O, that I don't know, my characters really do speak to me. I just a lot of stuff that I don't have planned or outlined. My characters just surprisingly come up with these things, and I guess they realized, the people who populate this gangsta world, they get the principles of Machiavelli and Adam Smith. I mean, Machiavelli, is it better to be feared or loved? This is something you got to think about if you're making your way in
That's
this
wonderful.
world of
Asking
jazz
that
musician.
question.
Yeah, is it better to be feared or loved? And one of Clyde's weaknesses is he can't decide. He kind of goes back and forth. And then there's the question of supply and demand. And so Clyde ends up making his fortune as a supplier of marijuana to jazz musicians. And back in 1936, when he first arrives in Harlem, marijuana is mainly only used by African Americans and jazz musicians. It hasn't gone mainstream yet. Jazz musicians are into it. They have a whole secret code around being a viper, which is a slang for a marijuana smoker. And it's part of their whole creative process in the 30s and 40s. Louis Armstrong called a marijuana medicine. So Clyde becomes the main supplier, and he makes a fortune. In the 40s, another drug comes on the scene, heroin. And the beboppers, Charlie Parker especially, they were really into heroin. And for Clyde, who loves jazz, wanted to be a musician, feels that he's helping musicians all the time, heroin is an existential threat to jazz because it's killing geniuses like Charlie Parker. So he is a principled marijuana dealer at war against unprincipled heroin dealers. And it comes down to supply and demand. And he's constantly having to stop his colleagues from, to his mind, betraying jazz and destroying lives and music by dealing heroin. And as one of his colleagues says, hey, they're junkies in Harlem. As long as they're junkies in Harlem, I'm going to be giving them junk. It's supply and demand. And so in the end, Clyde has to decide how much of a capitalist he is. I mean, how much of a Machiavellian and how much of a capitalist.
Oh, that's excellent. We not only are introduced to Clyde Morton, but you also introduce your readers to a delightful cast of characters whose nicknames alone had me rolling on the floor, brother. I'm sorry, I'm serious, man. Names like Pee Wee, Country, I loved Country, Pork Chop, Yo-Yo, Gentleman Jack. I mean, where do you come up with these names? I mean,
I don't know.
And each of them had a distinctive personality and player, whether they were characters, and I don't want to give too much of the novel away, but whether they're in Harlem or they're in LA or they're even in Paris, right? But they became real characters to me. And I have to tell you, brother, I got upset a couple of times when you killed some of them off too. Without revealing too much again, But yeah, I mean, there's that. It provides some flavor to the novel.
Yeah.
which is exciting.
Yeah, I have to say, it's the most mysterious part of writing to me, and one thing I don't stress it, but I always bring it up in teaching because I think you can teach creative writing. I've been doing it for a long time, but there's a lot of stuff that happens that just can't be taught, and so when it comes to organizing my own imagination or trying to guide my students, I'll focus on things like structure, the architecture of a story. How do you build suspense? What are the ways of creating an atmosphere? There are things that you can study in other writers and apply to your own writing. Where characters come from, how characters speak, this is totally mysterious to me. And I think in my daily organization of my life, I focus on structure because once I sit down in front of the keyboard, that's where this mysterious stuff happens. And I do think I have a pretty good ear. I think I have a good ear for how people talk, and I can get that down on the page. But beyond that, what they do, why they do it, it's I say it's like with each project, with each book or play, it's like an army of characters invades my imagination, occupies it for 2 or 3 years, then moves on. And then another army of characters comes in, occupies my imagination, and I'm at their mercy for 2 or 3 years. With Viper, I was imagining what it would be like to be at Panonica de Konigswater's house, and she had this big Bauhaus style mansion in Weehawken, New Jersey, with an amazing view across the Hudson River of Manhattan. And the nickname of this place was the Cat House, because one, it was the hangout for the black cats of the jazz world, and two, Panonica had 100 actual cats, furry,
The photos tell you
legged
that. They show
felines,
you that.
I mean, she was a real cat lady. And I thought, wow, reading this book, I thought, man, with the ambiance, wouldn't it be great to be there? But then I realized I'm allergic. If I were at the cat house, it would be hell. And so I actually made Viper allergic. And when people say to me, what do you have, Jake? What do you have in common with Clyde Morton? This guy, he's a gangster, he's a drug dealer, he kills people. I'm like, well, we're both allergic to cats. That's about it in terms of my
But
identifying with Viper.
that was reassuring for a friend to find out that was the only thing you had in common with him. Um, without being pedantic here, I mean, I'm a teacher, right? You're a teacher as well. And I always like when I can find new and interesting ways to introduce my students to my subject matter, right? So this book is a wonderful portrait, a rich portrait, right, of African American history and culture. Um, I mean, moving from the South to the North, the Pullman Porters, right? This whole idea of a migration of people and what happens to them. So this isn't just Clyde Morton's stories, it's this cast of characters who come to New York. And then your description of New York is fabulous. And then you took us, again, this is what's exciting about it. You go out to LA, right? And it's rich there. But you also get a little bit of Paris in there too. But it's, again, I'm coming back to African American history and culture because you not only take your readers into Harlem, for example, during its rich and evolving history, you offer an intimate portrait and record of conversations, right? And relationships and the inner life of African Americans in both private and communal moments. So I love the barbershop moments, I love the moment of people being in a jazz club and talking. And yeah, you've caught their voice. You not only got the nicknames, okay, but you've caught their conversation and values. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, well, the Great Migration, that's one of the huge themes of the book. And the Great Migration is especially in the 20th century, going back to the end of the 19th, but starting in the early decades of the 20th century, masses of African Americans moved from the South to, oh, look who's here, and moved from the South to from the rural South to the urban North in search of opportunities and a less, violent form of segregation and racial oppression. My parents both migrated from the rural South to the urban North to New York. And so I just grew up around people who had made this transition, and it just, Isabel Wilkerson's very interesting on this subject in the Warmth of Other Suns, a classic history of the Great Migration. Um, but I actually, I lived it in the sense that my uncles, aunts, cousins, a lot of people I knew had made that transition. I'm a born and bred New Yorker, but I, grew up with people who had lived in the South. And so a lot of the Black characters in this book, including Clyde Morton, came from the South. And Clyde, part of his backstory, it's not a spoiler. It happens very early on in the novel. Clyde's father, Chester Morton, named him a little wink to Chester Himes, but Chester Morton sent off to fight in World War II. He's sent to France. He comes back, or World War One, excuse me. He returns to the United States in 1918, and in 1919, at that point, they're living in the state of Georgia. He's the best blacksmith in the county. Before the war, all of his clients were Black. After the war, word has spread that Chester Morton's the best blacksmith in the county. In the end, white clients start coming to him. White blacksmiths threaten him, tell him not to take any more white clients. He says, this makes no sense. Why would you turn business away? He's lynched for being good at his job. So Clyde's father is lynched because he's good at his job, because he's an honest, hardworking man. So when Clyde, at 19, flees the South, he's arriving in New York with an idea that, capitalism is just corrupt to its core. Being a Black man and being good at your job is meaningless if you can get lynched. His brother sort of takes the opposite lesson from what happened to their father. He becomes a Pullman porter. And those are these guys who worked on the trains. They're in cap and uniform, and they waited on a largely white clientele on trains going all around America. A lot of Pullman porters were, one, highly educated, and two, very well thought of in the community. Clyde just sneers at them. He thinks his brother is a traveling butler, and he's out to make money and get rich any way he can, because he has no faith that being a good, hardworking American is gonna turn out well for him.
Well, let's talk about another aspect of the book. What was once illegal, right? Um, is now really purchasable in just about every American city, with the proper identification. And I'm talking about cannabis now. Is this book a critique of American culture and and practice regarding a substance formerly regarded as harmful? Marijuana was criminalized for Black folks when Black folks were using it. Jazz musicians were using it when artists were using it. But it's now been legalized for the masses. One character refers to himself as an investor, yet others view him as a dope dealer, a gangster, and a pimp. So, can you say a little bit more about, is this book a kind of critique of a substance and its use among a particular group of people, but now it can be found everywhere?
Yeah, well, I mean, the book explores, I say that the history and mythology. It's the history and mythology of jazz, the history and mythology of Harlem, and the history and mythology of the American drug culture between 1936 and 1961. The character you just cited, the self-proclaimed investor, is a man named Abraham Orlinsky, who made a fortune during Prohibition. Because, as he explains the principles of supply and demand, the government can say, oh, nobody drink alcohol. People are still going to demand alcohol. He makes a fortune supplying it. And Prohibition between 1919 and 1933 not only led to the rise of organized crime, it also led to the rise of organized crime fighting on the federal level. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, because alcohol was criminalized, this whole law enforcement apparatus was created. Once alcohol is legal again in 1933, this whole apparatus that's in place has to justify its existence. only in the 1930s is marijuana criminalized. You know, they're looking for, you know, they're a hammer looking for a nail, and it's like, oh well, here's this drug. It's mainly Black people using it. Mainly Black artists are in the know about this. Not only does this give us a chance to, you know, flex our law enforcement muscles, but we can basically, you know, keep track of this community, have social control over this community. But what happens in the course of the novel is marijuana begins to spread. And in the late 1950s, Viper and his partners have entirely new clientele. They've got the beatniks down in Greenwich Village. Hollywood hipsters are getting into marijuana. The thing is exploding. It's becoming international. There's supply chains coming over from Indochina now, as well as from the Caribbean, Mexico, a plantation in California. And Mr. O saw all this. Mr. O in 1938 says marijuana, you know, has a great potential. So where there's a rapport with today is that here we are. I mean, and I certainly never imagined marijuana would be legalized in so many states in America. But at the same time, you have this opioid and heroin epidemic happening in the states now. And in both cases, in the 1940s, it was, you know, when Viper's really at war, you know, the 40s and 50s, you've got marijuana being used, marijuana and heroin being used largely by African American jazz musicians. Now they've both gone totally mainstream. And in America today, you have marijuana, you know, shops all over the country. But because of the opioid crisis, pain relievers, fentanyl, people who then can't get their prescription drugs and turn to heroin, the scourge of the jazz world in the 1950s is now the scourge of all of mainstream America. So there's that rapport with today, even though the book ends in 1961.
So you can see the breadth of this book, right? And some of the things it covers. There's some things that I want to look at now, just with Jake. A couple of, I don't know how much more time we have, but which have to do with the way in which you've structured this book, right? We know Clyde Morton. We know he becomes Viper. Without giving too much away about what that name means, I love that, the origin of that. But I'm also interested in talking with you about the three wishes. Um, and you have this way of finding a way, man, a hook that just keeps a reader. And you know, I've read all your work, so you know, I'm sitting there like, damn, what are my three wishes? And and that's what I mean. You're reading the book and you're thinking about what are your three wishes, and the three wishes is the title of this book by Nika, the heiress. Um, in a way, it seems as though I keep thinking about people like Nancy Kennard, right? And the Negro Anthology, right? Being able to be an archivist. And this book is $395, y'all.
It is now. Not when I bought it.
I know. I was trying to go to my library. I'm permanently borrowing Jake's copy of it. Okay, but it's fascinating. The photography, but also the wishes of these jazz musicians. It's beautiful, man. I mean, and there's something almost ephemeral about it. Like the wishes were spoken in a moment, when she put a tape recorder or had them write it down or took a photograph of them. So everybody from, Thelonious Monk to Miles Davis, to so many other people are in this book. And this is one of the reasons why it's a treasure. But again, how does that work for you in this book as a way of structuring the narrative? Because it does work for you. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, what are my three wishes? I mean, I don't know if you all are thinking about, if somebody came up to you with a microphone or a recorder and said, what are your three wishes? What would they be? Right. So, yeah, could you say more about that?
Yeah, well, that's again how much this book was an inspiration for me. That I was, vaguely thinking about writing about jazz. I was inhaling Chester Himes novels, and then I came upon this book, and put myself in that situation and thought, okay, and that's when this character started to come to me, and my fiction, even my fictional works, but even my nonfiction work, my memoir, began with my desire to write about my father. So all my books begin with characters. I mean, so as much as I might be interested in a setting, as much as I might be interested in a theme, unless I have characters, it's not going anywhere. And Viper Morton came to me. I mean, in that magical way. I just kind of wrote a chronology of his life, from 1917 to 1961, and that's when I knew I had a good story. Um, so I placed him in the cat house in 1961, and have Nika ask him the question. But he's not a musician. He's a gangster, and he's been a gangster for 25 years. And on this night, he's committed the third murder of his 25-year gangster career. In 25 years, he's killed 3 people. The third person was the one he killed tonight, but this is the first time he's ever regretted it. He has no regrets about the first 2 murders, but this one has really messed him up. And so when she asks him this question, he actually stops and thinks. And what happened this night sends him in this whole reverie. He's a guy who just tends to shut out the past. I have him like many times in the book. He's just like, okay, I'm not thinking about that, and he just compartmentalizes his life and gets on with business. Here, he's totally traumatized and starts to try and piece together his whole past, because the murder that happened tonight is full of ramifications. So he's thinking about his 3 wishes. And really, only after I think I finished the first draft of the book did I realize there's a kind of rule of threes going on in this book. So it's the night of his third murder. He's contemplating his 3 wishes, and the corrupt cop, Red Carney, his partner in crime, has given him 3 hours to get out of the country. Yeah, 3 wishes, 3 hours, 3 murders. He's like, you got 3 hours or I'm coming after you, because he's just getting too sloppy, with these killings, and putting the whole enterprise at danger. But Red gives him a 3 hour advance, and he spends that time instead sitting in the cat house contemplating his wishes. In terms of the murder mystery structure, I think of this book as an inverted whodunit. Now, in the classic whodunit, and I wrote a whodunit. My book, If Six Were Nine, is a whodunit in form. I mean, it's about racial politics and all kinds of things, but it's set on a college campus in Ohio. And in classic form, you got the cadaver in the first chapter, a whole range of suspects throughout the book, and in the end, there's the resolution. It's a classic whodunit. I describe Viper's Dream as a whodot. So from the outset, he's killed 3 people. And in the course of his flashing back over his life, you see who the first victim was. You see who the second victim was. And so the reader is wondering, oh my God, who got it tonight? And that's the mystery that you only learn at the end of the book.
Can you give them a clue, tantalizing clue?
Never, never,
No?
never.
Good then. Good.
Never.
Well, then let me ask.
I have a dear friend who likes to read the last page of novels first. This drives me. I love her, but oh my God, that habit makes me crazy. People who read the last page first.
So can I ask a question like, what's Viper's Dream? Is that too much?
Well, Viper's Dream. So the title actually comes from a Django Reinhardt song. Django Reinhardt has a song called Viper's Dream, and guitar with Stefan Grappelli on violin. I love Django Reinhardt. I've always loved the song. Only when I was doing my research on this book did I find out what a viper was. And viper was jazz world slang for marijuana smokers. It came from the sound you make when you suck on a joint, the hiss. So these guys were always hissing off in the corner, and so people called them vipers. And Viper's Dream, that song is Dream of the Marijuana Smoker. There are all these songs with vipers in them, and it's hilarious. It's like this secret code in the jazz world. Fats Waller has a song called If You're a Viper. It's hysterically funny. You can find it on the internet in seconds. And so Clyde Morton, gets so into the herb and the business of the herb that he becomes the Viper. He's the Viper. So his initial dream is to be a jazz musician and to be a trumpetist, and that's over instantly. His first audition, Porkchop Bradley, the bass player, says, not only are you not a trumpet player, you're not a musician at all. He was just completely deluded, and so he has to let go of that dream right away. And his dream then becomes just to stay in Harlem, and then his dream becomes to be a successful man by the age of 23. He's working as a young gangster. He's got, he wears tailored suits, has an apartment on Lenox Avenue, drives a Cadillac. He feels like he's living a dream. But then Yolanda DeVray comes into his life, Yo-Yo DeVray, and she is, and when you write, if you're going to take a dive into genre, and I did very consciously want to write a hard-boiled, traditional noir novel. And so you have to embrace archetypes. And I'm not saying stereotypes, but an archetype. And the femme fatale is an archetype
Oh, and
in noir
Yo-Yo is
fiction.
a
And
femme fatale.
Yolanda Yo-Yo DeVray is a femme fatale.
I'm reading the book and I'm saying, brother, don't go there. Don't go there. Please
Yes.
back up.
Yes, Yo-Yo is trouble, and being with Yo-Yo, it becomes his ultimate dream. I mean, he's obsessed with this woman for 23 of the 25 years that the book covers. Um, she's a singer, jazz aspiring jazz diva, and I think for most of the book, she's his dream.
This particular work, Viper's Dream, has had a number of different incarnations, right? Um, and, I think it's worth just a round of applause to know that Jake has published his book in French and in England, and now it's coming out in America. So if we could just give him a round of applause, that's amazing, right? But could you talk about the other ways in which this work has made an appearance? Because it's made another appearance here in France as well.
Yeah, and once again, we have to go back to Mr. Himes, and I wrote a play. So one of the fun things about the life I've had in France, and I talked about this at length at the Red Wheelbarrow last week. I've only been published in French the last 17 years. I've been writing in English, but my work's been presented, whether it's plays, radio plays, or books. I've not been published in English in almost 2 decades. So this is a cause for much celebration that this book is coming out in English. But I was working on a play. I was working out in Bobigny at a theater called the MC93 in the banlieue parisienne, and I was a literary consultant to a director who liked to adapt novels, especially American novels, to the stage. And I'd always been an avid theater goer, but I'd never thought about writing for the theater until I started working with this director. And I had an idea for a novel for years about um, this famous argument between Richard Wright and James Baldwin that had taken place at the Café de Mago, and I've known about this argument since I was at college, at least. That Wright had considered Baldwin his protege. He felt Baldwin turned on him, and they had this famous argument that went on for hours about loyalty and art and race and politics, and only when I came to France and discovered Chester Himes did I learn that during that whole epic hours-long argument, Chester Himes had been sitting at the table the whole time. All three writers wrote about what happened that night. Each one gave a very different version of events. And so I thought, okay, I've now got to dive in on that. So I thought I was going to write that as a novel. But working in theater, I thought, oh, let me try this as a play. So you can actually hear, Wright and Baldwin and Himes. And so I wrote this, anyway, wound up being, supported by a French fellowship. It originally was presented on stage in French. You were there at the Théâtre de Rond-Point years ago. And ultimately it was adapted for French radio. And it was while working in French radio that I discovered that Radio France has the rights to play any song you can name. And at the time, I had this pretty detailed outline for a novel of Viper's Dream. And again, as I say, I consciously obsess on architecture. So I had a structure for the book, but I didn't have the insides of the characters. But I had this outline that I just sort of been sitting on for a couple of years. And when I learned Radio France could play any song you could name. They had the rights to do that. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do this as a radio play? And I so enjoyed working on Brothers in Exile, working with the actors, working with my brilliant director, Laurence Courtois, that I shifted gears, wrote an entire outline for Viper's Dream as a 10-episode radio drama. After I finished the script for the radio drama, I returned to the outline for the novel. So I call them non-identical twins. You know, these two works gestated and were born at the same time, but the resemblance is not that strong. You know, it's the same story and characters, but in the novel version, there's just a whole literary voice that's not in the radio play, where you're limited to dialogue and 25 minutes per episode. But the radio play was recorded, 13 days of recording with an amazing cast, 50 actors, 35 Black actors. No one could remember any production in France anywhere that employed 35 Black actors at one time. It's aired three times on France Culture. Very well received. It was a wonderful experience, but very different from the novel. And so I turned to the novel. The radio play aired for the first time in 2019. Publication of the novel in France was delayed by a year, of course, because of COVID. So the French publication then came out. My French editor connected me with a British publisher, so the book has just come out in Britain. It's getting a wonderful response in England. I'm touched and surprised. And thanks to the British publication, I've got an American publisher. So I'll be back in the American market in September 19th. Crooked Lane Books, a part of Penguin Random House. They're bringing it out in America. So it's a very roundabout story.
Do we have a couple of minutes or we're out of time?
We've got time for audience questions now. We have time for one last question. If
One
you'd like
last
to
question?
ask it, go ahead, please.
The playlist. Talk about that. I mean, I know you got some of these ideas for the jazz music, for the jazz music from from France Couture and the radio version of this. But it's one thing for us, you can buy a soundtrack now to a movie, right? But it was something for me to kind of stop reading and put on Louis Armstrong's West End Blues, right? Or to listen to Around Midnight, or to listen to Django Reinhardt, play Viper's Dreams. Yeah, where did that idea come from? To actually give the reader a playlist, and is that part of the book that you want them to engage with too?
Well, I was inspired to do the radio version when I found out Radio France could broadcast any tune you could name. So the script is 10 episodes, 25 minutes per episodes, and there are musical selections in the script. I could basically create a score for the action in the radio drama. And so, for instance, when he sees Yolanda for the first time, I wrote, we hear Duke Ellington's Prelude to a Kiss, 1957 recording with Johnny Hodges on saxophone. And Laurence Courtois says, great, fine. I mean, anything I wanted. It was crazy. And so the music became the ambiance. And that was actually the biggest challenge for me once I was done with the script and switching to the novel. I realized how much I'd let the music do the background work. I had to come up with the descriptions of Harlem and what you're seeing. But I'd finished the book, and my editor at Rivage, Jean Guillaume, it was pretty late in the process. It was a few months from publication, and she said, maybe we should have a playlist at the back. And I said, well, Jean, I had 100 songs in France Culture. She said, okay, half. Take like the 50 songs, because I did continue to listen to this music while I was writing the novel. I mean, really, I finished the radio script, went right into the novel. It probably was between drafts of the novel when we recorded the radio version. So really, the two projects are happening at the same time. So it was Jan's idea. And so I picked, it was hard, but I narrowed the list down to 50. And then my British publisher, Ian Mills, No Exit Press, part of Bedford Square Publishing, Ian Mills, brilliant publisher, he had the idea of putting a Spotify code, or I'm so incompetent with this stuff, QR code. No, I'm told it's not a QR code, it's a Spotify playlist, but it's in the book. So you can zap on that and get the playlist. And I thought Jean's idea to have the playlist in the French version was already a great idea. Yeah, people loved that. But then to have it available on your phone is even more brilliant. But to me, it's just like it's a little dessert, you know. It's even after dessert. It's an after dinner mint, you know. It's the meal is the novel, you know. The playlist, you know, you can have afterward.
Can we have a big round of applause, please? We're now going to open this up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, go ahead, raise your hand. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Yes, someone very brave.
So do you think you're done with this world? Or are you going to stay in this period? Are you moving forward in time, back in time? What's next?
I'm certainly done with this story, and I really I just don't do sequels, and you know, about half my books fit into the crime genre, and in the crime genre they always want you to have a recurring character, and I people I've just never thought about doing it, and I do have two books that are linked, Rendezvous 18th and Goes to Saint Michel. They're both set in Paris, but the main characters in Rendezvous 18th don't appear in Goes to Saint Michel at all, and some of the secondary characters of Rendezvous 18th are the main characters in Goes to Saint Michel, but there's no other connection between the two books. No, I'm onto something else. But well, you know, I don't know why I've been so drawn to the past. Now, this is interesting for me because my first works, you know, my first 6 books up to Goes to Saint Michel were set in the time I was writing, and then something happened, and I wrote a book that hasn't been published in English. It's called Postérité. It's a novel. Thank you very much. A novel about a painter. We have a happy painter reader in the back there. It's a novel about a painter. It's a novel about a Dutch female abstract expressionist painter, which, you know, my agent was, a little, stunned to receive. And typical of my career, nobody bought it in America. The French lapped it up, loved it. It was published to, wonderful reviews, and in the end, decent sales even. So Postérité is set in the past. I mean, it goes up to the early 2000s, but most of the action is in the 40s and 50s. And then I went on to Brothers in Exile, where much of the story takes place in 1953. Then I went into Viper's Dream. Now I'm writing a story set in 1958. I don't know why this happened. I don't know if this is me getting older or me getting just baffled by the world today to such an extent that I feel like I have to write about the distant past to understand what's happening now. Parallels between today and the past. That's not usually the inspiration, you know. I think that's something that I become aware of after the writing is actually done. I don't know what is drawing me to the past, but the new work, it's set in New York in 1958, and once again, this is one of those things. And oh, I always tell this to my students: don't throw anything away ever. I wrote a sketch, 5 pages in 2010 or 11, didn't know what to do with it, set it aside. Sometime during one of the lockdowns, I pulled this thing out and I was like, hey, I can do something with this now. And so I saw it certainly as a short novel, but then started to see the possibilities of a radio play. So I'm actually, once again, this is going to have 2 lives. So I'm currently under contract with France Culture again for a radio version of this story, and I'm freaking out about the deadline because I'm not making as much progress as quickly as I should. But I will certainly write it as a radio version first. But again, I have a separate plan for the novel version. So once I'm done with the radio version, I'll turn to the novel, and it worked well with Viper's Dream, so I hope it works with this one. This one's more. It's not as much a genre work. It's kind of noir-ish. I think a lot of my books are sort of thriller-ish. You know, there's a intrigue and a plot that drives, but nowhere near in the same way as Viper's Dream.
Other questions? Yeah. Microphone.
I can be really loud. Oh, of course. So kind of staying with the same theme. Hi. Writing about a period in the past that you haven't lived through, certainly not as an adult, is kind of like writing in a locale that you've never visited. So what I want to know is how you feel about writing locales that you've either never visited or only know as a brief tourist or something of the sort.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it's probably the single biggest challenge that I've had writing about the past. Imagining the past, and I do throw myself into research, but I'm not a writer who loves research. You know, I mean, I know writers who would never leave the library if if they didn't have to finally write the thing and get it published. I'm not like that, and I also don't like novels where you feel the weight of the research. This happens more often than you would think, and it can just it can kill a novel, really, where you just feel that this author just has to let you know that they knew exactly what happened in Paris in 1899, and you know, and it's just it's deadly. Um, so I did a lot of research with Viper's Dream, but sometimes it was almost intuitive. You know, someone would tell me about a book about Harlem. I'd take a look at it. I'd read a reference to somebody from the past. I'd do a search on the internet and find that person. I'd find out about a different jazz club to see what happened with what was going on there, and I do take a lot of liberties, and this was something that I had to learn. And when I was writing Brothers in Exile, the play about Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Chester Himes, I won a fellowship for that book, a French fellowship, of course, the Beaumarchais Fellowship, and they support people working on dramatic works, whether for television, radio, or theater. And at the reception for the people who've been awarded the Beaumarchais that year, I got the grant just on the basis of the first 15 pages of the play, and I was talking to one of the judges, and I told him, listen, I'm drowning here. I'm in this ocean of research. Wright, Baldwin, and Himes were all really prolific. I feel like I have to read everything they ever wrote, everything that was ever written about them, before I can go any further. And he was like, no, Jake, you're writing fiction. And he was an author of historical fiction. He's like, this isn't a documentary. This isn't a biography. This is your Richard Wright, your James Baldwin, your Chester Himes. And that was the most liberating thing I could have heard. And so by the time I got to Viper's Dream, I was like, yeah, this is my Harlem. This is my recording session in 1945. If the jazz nerds want to tell me, oh no, Dizzy wasn't in the room then. No, he is in my version. I felt a real freedom to present my vision of Harlem. And I say that there is a sort of once upon a time in Harlem feeling about this novel. That I just want the research to feel light. I just want to feel like, yeah, you walked into that place and you don't know how many hours I spent trying to find out about the feel, trying to get the feel right.
We have time for one final question. Yes.
Yes, from the sound of it, you have had a lot of success in the French culture. But now that you're coming back to the American culture, how do you expect to impact the community, especially the African American community, within this book?
Well, we'll have to see how much attention it gets, and I've had kind of a checkered career in the States. My first book was very well received. It's a memoir called Bourgeois Blues that was published before you were born in 1991, and that book really, that's the only time I think I've written a book with a readership in mind. And I thought, I felt that no one was writing books for Black people of my generation. I was 30 when I published that book, and I wanted to write something that people of my generation will respond to, and they did. And to this day, I'll still meet young African American readers who will tell me that that was an important book for them. That was beautiful. I did have a moment years later. I was living in Europe, and the book had come out in France by then, and I was talking to a woman. She was in her 90s, and it was still, I don't know. Anyway, she was in her 90s, and European. And the book was very much about my relationship with my father. And she had read the book, and she said to me, you know, my father was just like yours. So she's talking about some Middle European guy from the 19th century. And my dad from the rural South in the 1930s, they had this connection. And that's when I really appreciate how universal work can be. You know, I mean, and I think you really have to drill down into the specifics of experience to really be able to be universal. You know, paradoxically, that's how you end up reaching a lot of people. I want readers wherever I can find them, you know, and so I'll see. You know, I mean, again, the book did well in France. The book came out in France a year and a half ago and did very well. It's coming out in Britain now, and you know, it's only been out for a couple of weeks. It's getting a wonderful reception. And so I hope, you know, we'll see if Americans respond in the same way. I have no publicity planned for America right now, but I will go where I'm asked, Zoom where I'm asked to Zoom, and would love to connect with readers. And really, if it comes to African American readers in particular, I would love for them to feel how vivid this history is. You know, these 25 years in the history of Harlem, in the history of jazz, you know, just get people to appreciate, you know, the history. And we didn't get to talk too much about culture. You know, I mean, that this book is really, whether it's vernacular or food or music, just the way people hang out, the book is just completely plunged into African American culture. You know, when people tell me, oh, there's no African American culture, there's only American culture, I'm like, you never had dinner at my grandmother's house. You know, no, there is an African American culture, and it's on every page of this book. And so that would be something I would want African American readers to appreciate in particular.
Can we have a big